persons. And then the first question,
I think you answered that already,
okay.
about the relationship between the constitution and the relevant. You were saying that some courts were functioning as both reviewing the constitution and treaties.
in
Because
Belgium.
they were, yes.
In
No,
Belgium.
that was in Belgium, yes.
Yes.
No, sorry. What about the Netherlands on that? Sorry.
Well, the focus really is on the convention. I mean, in multiple articles you will find, Dutch scholars saying themselves that the European Convention on Human Rights really functions as sort of default constitution. So one of the main objectives with this proposal and with previous proposals is to reinvigorate the constitution as actually being important, because even when the constitution can be invoked, it most of the time isn't, or it is, but not in a similarly important way as the convention. So there's a clear difference.
Charlotte?
Yes, I wanted to recast the question about the control of conformity of the constitution eventually to international treaty, and is there such a control? Because from what you said, the hierarchy of norms is superheaded by the international conventions. So what about the conformity of the constitution to the treaties, if any? And second, if there is a preference for the European Convention, is there in the Dutch constitution a catalogue of rights or not? It is the same. Is there a discrepancy between the ECHR and what about the control of these differences, or the compatibility?
Well, there is the constitutionality. The constitutional review is actually just done by in the political process.
Oh, okay.
I mean, that's when it ends, and that's one of the criticisms, is that there should be afterwards, because you cannot predict how international treaties, especially when they're supervisory bodies, or as the European Court of Human Rights, expanding the scope of it, there's no control afterwards. That's one of the reasons, the whole bringing rights home kind of discourse, to let the Dutch judges also have an input, because now they're just following the European Court of Human Rights very carefully.
So
And
even ordinary judges could do the job. I mean,
Ordinary judges.
ordinary, not constitutional court.
Normal.
though there's no
There is no
constitutional court.
There is no constitutional
There's no constitutional court in the Netherlands. I mean,
But
the only
also-
proposal is to introduce diffuse review.
Sure.
There's been a few Dutch scholars that have been proponents of constitutional court, but it's been very rare, especially after looking at the Belgian example, when you saw the dispute arising between the ordinary courts and the constitutional court about power, because they're both kind of doing a similar job, and both are saying that they have the last word, and then the Cour de Cassation doesn't want to refer to the constitutional court, and it creates all these issues. So they didn't want to do that. So the only proposals that have been somewhat successful and moving forward have been for diffuse review. And it doesn't seem like that's going to change at all. And then with the what was it? The
The
second.
constitution and the treaties, the hierarchy between the two.
But
that
the
was-
ECHR and the catalogue of rights.
Yes, there is a very great overlap, but in a similar sense as there is a great overlap with, for instance, the Belgian constitution. It's the rights are somewhat the same, but they're formulated quite differently. They're formulated more in the old sense, early 19th century. It's very different in the formulation. There's not the sort of limitation clauses as you find in Europe. That's also one of the arguments, is saying that the constitution, the constitutional rights catalog is not appropriate for constitutional adjudication. But there are some extra rights, such as the freedom of education is more so protected, and also you have the ban on censorship, which is also, you can also find in the Belgian constitution. And also often there's referred to the lawmaker has to do this, the wets, and in Belgium this has been interpreted as statute in the formal sense, so that there cannot be any delegation, while in the European Convention on Human Rights this is taken law or statute in the European Convention is a lot broader. So there is more protection in that sense as well, but it's been often claimed that the extra protection is quite limited. But there is some, but it's quite limited.
No, I was interested in Jean-Louis' idea about renationalisation of rights, and of course it has been a cross-cutting theme, hasn't it, in all these jurisdictions, and of course in the French reforms and in English reforms, but and the old Dutch discussion in Scandinavia. But it takes very different forms, and it may mean quite different things, I expect, in the different jurisdictions. So cross-cutting analysis there also could be very interesting, you know, so that, for instance, if you have also as a starting point a mirror principle. I never really understood how you could have a mirror principle and comply with the convention, because the convention are norms which do not depend on the sanctioning by the European Court of Human Rights. That's just a sanctioning of breaches, isn't it? So that if you're waiting for the court to establish that a national practice is in breach, well, you're basically in breach, aren't you? And this time continuum perspective is well illustrated, for instance, by the Goodwin case, you know, so that countries then, if you before the Goodwin case continued to discriminate against transsexuals, then you were in breach. Germany had the Frankfurt case. They did not give certain medical costs, didn't cover them. And before Goodwin, on the basis of facts before Goodwin, the court found they were in violation, and it was obvious. I mean, there was never a question of it. It's just an example of something which was obvious under the system. So I can't understand how a mirror principle can be defended. And then you now see how the English courts, the UK courts, who really regard themselves as quite conservative in many ways, with all this pressure, they now, in case after case over the last 2 years, have said, and they had this split, you know, should they take account of what I just said? And then they have, in some cases, I think now pretty clearly said that they have to, so they can't wait for Strasbourg court to establish a breach. Secondly, they also, in some cases, say it's not a question of saying that this will follow from the case law jurisprudence. It just hasn't been stated by the court yet. But they even go in cases where they find that there's no obvious guidance in the Strasbourg jurisprudence whatsoever, you know, and they still go forward. You know. So it's not only in a way, you know, following a line and trying to apply the convention, but it's also a question of actually using the convention beyond what there's any kind of guidance for at all. Again, this differs so much from country to country. So then, in terms of renationalisation, what does this mean is an area which really asks for comparative analysis. And back to the Scandinavian systems, I think also, well just in a way, the Scandinavian systems, and I refer to the way the Norwegian Supreme Court had started to use principles. So they didn't look at the convention, the being minority maybe looking at the convention and finding breach and therefore setting aside the legislation, but the majority then say we must set aside legislation or reinterpret it in light of general principles. And in a way which is very radical, really, really radical, clearly against the wording. So it is setting aside on the basis of a principle. That creates a problem in relation to your empirical inquiry, you know, because you really then have to have it's very difficult to have a quantitative analysis, because the whole area then reflects perhaps not only the express reasons given. The last point then, which is then related, is, say, you go back to the important UK case about terrorist detention and 2004. A, isn't it? That's A.
Yeah.
And William starts. Magna Carta, habeas corpus, age-old principles, Blackstone says, all of that. And then it's fantastic, you know. And then he's straight into the case law of the European Human Rights Court, but he never loses the link, you know. So somehow it is a continuum. And then at the time, I know he had two things in mind. But it's not there in the decision. So you have, it's a bit circumstantial. But I'm absolutely certain he had two things in mind. The first was that a decision based on the European Court jurisprudence alone will be an easy target. Now, on the other hand, it's quite easy for a court to say Strasbourg made us do it. You know, so that deflects in a way criticism. But on the other hand, it can also strengthen criticism against the decision. And I think in his mind that would weaken the authority and the legitimacy of the court's work. It had to do this, and it had to have as good justification as possible. And the best in terms of conservative criticism would be habeas corpus Magna Carta. But then he also had a second idea. And I think that was that you should have this dynamic perspective in developing common law rights and European Convention rights. And I think that also led to, which is then my last sentence, and that is that he saw that the pressure could build up against the Human Rights Convention. And then if you ever left it, what should you then do with all your human rights jurisprudence? Well, you wanted it to be standing. So you wanted human rights jurisprudence you had not to depend on a political decision to perhaps abolish the Human Rights Act and recreate if you could. He wrote that they couldn't. In his view, it was against constitutional principles. It's an irreversible process. But say it was done, then I think his idea was that A would stand because it was the development of a common law rule principle which was older than parliamentarism and supremacy of parliament. It was just really fundamental. So, you know, all of these things are, of course, interwoven.
Yeah, the reason why I mentioned the mirror principle was because there is a really good, unfortunately it's in Dutch, so it won't make much sense to you probably, but by a Dutch scholar which actually compared the UK situation with the Dutch situation. She says that actually Dutch courts, when you're talking about the issues of the mirror principle, for instance in the Saldus case, with lawyers having to be present for police interrogation stuff, there was a lot of criticism on the case in the Netherlands, and then so the Supreme Court, as soon as they could, made a decision even before there was any case against the Netherlands, and even when there was room for interpretation of what the court actually said, the European Court said, they already made their decision. Because to their thing, they have to provide the same protection, but when the court doesn't give specifics, they make their own decision. So the Supreme Court in the Netherlands is quite free in that sense of just kind of making their interpretation at that time, and as one judge says, we'll see, what happens then. We'll apply the case law as good as we can, and then we'll see what happens if, we get a violation or not. But we'll already decide, because then there's no insecurity. There's no legal insecurity. So that's kind of what they do in practice. But when they do know that there is a sort of standard, they will not go above it. They've even reversed their case law because they offered more protection. And then they saw that the European Court didn't, and then they kind of reversed their case law and gave less protection the next time. So they're quite careful about following.
There's one in the Norwegian case law that one of the reasons for using principles is exactly that you don't want to have the argument. Not that they necessarily would have about to follow it, but they don't even want the argument that Strasbourg has said something else. so that you have to lower the protection. If they tie it up with the general principle, of course it's independent of what Strasbourg Lake does. So that's one argument, anyway.
Well, perhaps I should offer a couple of scattered remarks, not to conclude, I mean, we have time, but to tell you what I've been learning listening the presentation. So the first point is that these recent development, to focus on the recent development in the Northern European countries, are important and significant for people who work on constitutional adjudication because they add sort of new layer on old story. As I've been already saying, constitutional adjudication originated in a different context, in federal system, in the administrative adjudication, and in Europe, most notably, not only in Europe, everywhere in the world, in post-authoritarian regimes. So the most recent development are interesting because they took places in countries which are not post-authoritarian, not with the exception of Belgium federal system, and not a country that have a tradition of administrative law. So this new development seems to show that judicial review, to use the American term, is becoming something which is not anymore an exception as it was 50 years ago. I mean, 50, 60 years ago, judicial review existed only in the United States and in the past Norwegian legal tradition. Yeah. So now, the only significant country in the world, and that's an important fact, which has no form of judicial review, is China. All the other countries, included somehow, I'll come back to that, the United Kingdom, have, to use the language of an American debate, a strong or weak form of judicial review, with the exception of China. And Saudi Arabia, but we don't care, that's just oil. It's not a legal system. Now, this is something we have to think about. Norberto Bobbio, probably 30 years ago, wrote a short booklet claiming that after the Second World War we have been entering in a new era, the era of rights. Rights became the central problem of the democratic societies. But if this is true, that obliges us to come back to a point that Björk mentioned this morning, to rethinking constitutional theory and political theory. The classical theory of what we call, with the French word, democracy, was the theory of the representative government where authority was exercised by elected organs. CAS used a word to qualify the representative government which disappeared, but it's used now again in the American debate. They don't know CAS, but the word is to qualify the classical representative government. The word used by CAS was, said, de l'électionnisme. There are wonderful manuscripts where he uses this word because the classical theory of representative government we call now democracy is based on the idea that political authority can be exercised only by elected and accountable organ. That's the basis, for instance, of CAS opposition to the royal veto, because the king is not elected and not accountable. This is basically the theory presented by James Madison in the Federalist Paper when he claims that a republic, no one used the word democracy, they use representative government here, republic in the United States, is a political system where authority is exercised by organs elected and accountable to the voters. Now, this form of government is not anymore the one which characterizes contemporary systems we still call democracies. Constitutional courts or courts in general exercise what Kelsen called the function of Rechtserzeugung, production of norms. In our language, legislation is divided. Production of norms, legal norms, is divided between elected and non-elected organs. The classical political and constitutional theory is not enough to describe these new systems. So, the new development in Northern Europe are relevant because what was claimed 20 years ago, that that's a problem of post-fascist regimes, because 20 years ago, where there was an important system of constitutional justice, in Germany, in Italy, and then later on in Spain and Portugal. What are these countries? Post-fascist countries. Then the new wave was after the collapse of the Soviet Empire. But what is the post-Soviet Empire? A post-authoritarian system. So, but now if we listen at you guys from the Northern Europe, there is that's nothing to do with Nazis. Or with communists. Well, these countries like Netherlands, Belgium, the United Kingdom, Iceland is the oldest parliamentary system in the world. They do not have any experience of authoritarian regime like the European continent. So that's the first important point. The second interesting question has to do, and I want to come back to Charlotte's presentation, with the United Kingdom. My colleague Stephen Gartbaum, who is a British citizen but professor at UCLA in Los Angeles, has a new book which is going to be out in January, where he put together a set of articles he has been publishing, claiming that the United Kingdom invented a new version of judicial review, the weak judicial review. Now, in my opinion, if we define judicial review, it's a question of definition, as the possibility for courts to nullify statutes, in my opinion, in the United Kingdom, there is no weak judicial review. There is no judicial review at all. Charlotte was quite clear, even though it was too quick at the end of her presentation, explaining that the courts, and that's at least what I understand, you can correct me if I'm wrong, the English courts can only send a request to the member of the cabinet competent for the topic to ask the government to modify the law. So it's not at all a form of judicial review, but is a sort of complaint that the court sends to the government asking, and then again it would be interesting to know what happens. How many times, because again this is a paradox, we learn more, and learning more we realize that we don't know much about what happens. We have a better ideas, we have better questions, but we don't have answers to our questions. So I've never been able, also in England, when my British colleagues, do we know what is going on statistically with the Human Rights Act? The government answers positively or doesn't answer to the judge's request. Well, we need to learn more about all that. But so this is another interesting question. Is there a weak form, or is just a different system which is not really judiciary? Third point, and I can be extremely telegraphic on that because it has been discussed. It's a very complex question. Even though in the Northern European countries the models is basically the American one of judicial review, not of constitutional adjudication, the Northern European countries, like the European countries in general, have a problem which doesn't exist in the United States. As you know, in the United States there was even an attempt to impeach Justice Stephen Breyer because he wanted to quote foreign jurisprudence for an opinion. So Americans are extremely violently nationalist in the legal culture. And that's not the case in Europe because we live in this mixed system. It's a little bit the case in the United Kingdom, which should be a state of the United States rather than a member of the European Union, but that's a different point. So we have this double hierarchy of norms, with all the problem you have been telling us. Finally, I found very interesting your presentation of the Dutch debate because it shows elements of the general debate. I mean, I don't know anything about the Dutch debate because I don't read Dutch, but all the things I know in the other languages match largely. So there is, we don't know about the reality, but the theoretical debate is clear and is quite universal. I was finding in your presentation the same type of discussion we have at NYU in New York between people in favor and against. So this is very interesting to know. And one point in your presentation struck me as particularly interesting. Now I'm speaking as a political theorist, not as a constitutional lawyer. The question of why politicians give up power to judges, which is what happened with judiciary. I mean, judges cannot do much without some authorization from the political class because Constitution, for instance, are not